Testing 1, 2, 3. Nice shooting. Okay. We're about 7 minutes away. Uh, I'll wait a few more minutes. Okay, I'll begin a little early. 19 November, 2025. Dis and dat information, welcome. I did do a recording of yesterday's. It wasn't at the time of the usual time, but it is there on, it should be prior to this recording. Yesterday's was on ways in which you could think about culturally cognitive capitalism. Models and theories of cognitive capitalism are important, and they allow us to give us a framework against which we could address certain key questions that haven't been fully addressed in Marxism. That is, I mean, they've been addressed. It's just that Marx didn't address them, or they've been addressed differently because he never got to fully articulate, for example, approaches to uh, financial capitalism, the larger context of which manifests itself in the late 19th century, but really isn't as doesn't become, well, is more critical now than ever before. And so, in thinking about that, yesterday's stuff included an opening or a movement from sort of Keynesian models for looking at aggregate demand, et cetera, and giving us the analytical tools to be able to say there's certain elements of, in a post-Keynesian sense, of how to model certain types of things that fit into what has become more interesting in under rentier capitalism. And all of those things are sort of filling in the blanks for what wasn't fully realized during Marxist time, but is still there. And it manifests itself daily. So I came across another thing, a new book. Well, 2024, a book by Mizuoka called Mizuoka, right? Subsumption and Marxist Geography. The Subsumption of Space, Fujio Mizuoka, a theory of Marxist geography. Marxist geography has a long and storied history. It, of course, had a kind of diversion or became problematized, let's put it that way, in the context of Soviet geography. But, you know, there a Marxist or several versions of Marxist radical geography have emerged. The problematic, of course, is that its best use was in certain elements of city planning, ideas about city planning anyway, the questions of location, questions of the disposition of space. And all of those are important, easily made important relative to political economy. And what this particular text does, it's a 2024 translation of a 2002 text. And what it gives us a sense of is not only what was going on, what has been going on, and in Japanese geography, but more specifically a left Japanese geography that addresses some or all of the same issues that kind of overlapped with other, you could call them post-structural, just call them post-war Marxist approaches to a variety of texts. Alrighty, so with that somewhat flimsy description, let's begin. In this context, we'll look at the introduction, and if we get to it, the first chapter. If not, we'll continue on tomorrow. So, the core category of Marxist geography. Space has increasingly been given its due position in the system of social sciences since the last quarter of the 20th century, to the degree that space and time are fundamental components of human experiences. Sachs' text is quite good on that, 1986, in terms of addressing a more liberal version of what counts as the social nature of space. Yet there is no systematic presentation of the dialectics of space and society. This book, therefore, aims to fill this conceptual gap by providing a more rigid and dialectical social logic of space, to formulate what French sociologist Henri Lefebvre termed spatiology, spatiology, by filling the missing link in the theory of Marxism that bridges the existing theory of political economy and various spatial phenomena. Note that the author here actually studied with a variety of folks, including David Harvey. So I think David Harvey actually sat in on his doctoral committee. But anyway, that bridges the existing theory of political economy and various spatial phenomena, including social struggles related to space. It thereby intends to extend and substantiate the discourse that Lefebvre embarked on in his book, The Production of Space, to, quote, to expose the actual production of space by bringing the various kinds of space and the modalities of their genesis together within a single theory, close quote, or a political economy of space, which is, you know, what I've been fiddling around with. The noting, of course, that the political economy of space is also a political economy of signs, etc. Although Lefebvre's conceptual contribution is profound indeed, his single theory is unfortunately not well systematized. No, it is not. In building a single unitary theory of space, this book adopts the method of a more structured theoretical deduction. This is the theoretical procedure called ascent, A-S-C-E-N-T, see chapter 1, that Karl Marx adopted in formulating the body of theory as presented in the book in the volume Capital. Of course, in Marx's mind, there would have been thousands of cases of economic transactions by market agencies or exploitation by capitalists. In the case of geography, presenting inductively from all the sociospatial processes taking place in space can do little more than demonstrate the melange of disorganized facts, unless it is clear where and how to abstract the theory out of them, which ironically requires guidance from further theory. Therefore, in constructing a new spatial theory of political economy, this book takes the deductive steps of dialectics to explain the socio-spatial processes lacking in conventional Marxist social science. It thereby attempts to bridge the gully between the existing theory and the actual socio-spatial processes that develop in the real world. Through this theoretical praxis, Marxist social science is elevated to a more affluent whole that includes space as an indispensable logical moment. Quote, the law of space resides within space itself. The task of Marxist geography is to prove that there is indeed a logic with which spatial differentiation is created endogenously within the social system. Spatial differentiation created endogenously within the social system. Thus, two crucial conditions emerge at the beginning. First, the theoretical body of Marxist geography should not assume spatial differentiation at the start of the theoretical ascent, A-S-C-E-N-T, the theoretical ascent. That is, Marxist geography attempts to explain the existing spatial differentiation based not on empirical description, but through the logics of space embedded in the property of space and society themselves. The logic of space embedded in the property of space and society themselves. They should be duly exposed and integrated into the system of Marxism. Therefore, second, the crucial logical moment of the discipline, space, must not be abstracted away from the theoretical body at any point. It is a logical error to assume something that is to be demonstrated in the explanation at the outset. To assume a spatially differentiated social product at the beginning of the logical ascent is identical to assuming that such differentiated space is an indispensable logical moment for the genesis of the unevenness of the economic landscape and its unequal development, or claiming that without assuming such differentiated space at the beginning, there is no way for capitalism to generate endogenously such spatial unevenness and inequality. In other words, to assume differentiated space at the outset is to assume, as with John Browett, 1984, that capitalism is incapable of generating an uneven landscape and an unequal development intrinsically and endogenously. Browett supports the view that inequalities in the spatial organization of society are not necessary to, nor systematic consequences of, the logic of the capitalist mode of production. Browett sees the emergence of unevenness in capitalism as both spontaneous and socially unplanned, and a contingent factor which individual capital or capitalists may at certain times be able to take advantage of. Kostas Hadjimikolas, 1984, makes a claim similar to this, in that In the capitalist's attempt to improve technology, general conditions of social production across regions and sectors tend to equalize toward a social average, producing at the same time a homogeneous space, which minimizes capitalist expansion, since no excess profits can be obtained with equal rates of profit in all sectors and all regions. According to Hadjimikalis, the factor of differentiation to integrate into this tendency of equalization does not come from the laws of motion of the capitalist mode of production, but only from an intervention by a political agent producing changes in the character of the dominant social relations of production, exchange, and consumption. Now, these claims resemble Doreen Massey's idea that spatial change is understood predominantly as an effect of the response to non-spatial developments, and autonomy is not accorded to the spatial dimension. Hadjimikalis, too, asserts that the inner logic of capital does not have power to create spatial differentiation, but it must be explained by means of such an exogenous factor as a political agent. For Browett, uneven regional development is not something which can be known in advance on the basis of theory. The three authors share a reluctance to admit a relatively autonomous theoretical sphere dealing with spatial subsumption and unevenness. A relatively autonomous theoretical sphere dealing with spatial subsumption and unevenness. The understanding of this book is contrary to these writers. The inequalities in the spatial organization and its unequal development are part and parcel of the inevitable inner logic of capitalist reproduction and accumulation. If the creation of spatial unevenness and differentiation is a part of the necessary logic of capitalism, then capitalism must be capable of generating such unevenness or differentiation endogenously, regardless of the existence or non-existence of differentiated space in the beginning. The economy and society should be capable of creating unevenness in the economic landscape and unequal development, even if it is transplanted onto a featureless plane. The economy and society should be capable of creating unevenness in the economic landscape and unequal development, even if it is transplanted onto a featureless plane. Thus, the dialectics in establishing the core category of Marxist geography lie in the following. We must assume space as the crucial moment of Marxist economic geography from the beginning. Yet, in the meantime, we must not assume spatiality, that is, spatial differences, simultaneously. The task of Marxist geography is to explain the existing spatial differentiation based not on empirical description, but through building the conceptual blocks of Marxism. Since geography contains space as the indispensable moment, the moment of space must not be abstracted away from the theoretical body of geography. As pointed out earlier, it is a logical error to assume something that is to be proven in the proof at the beginning. Yes. Therefore, since the object of Marxist geography is to prove that spatial differentiation is created endogenously within the economic system, the theoretical body of geography should not assume spatial differentiation at the starting point of the theoretical ascent. The capitalist mode of production must be capable of creating unevenness in the economic landscape and unequal development endogenously, even if it is transplanted onto a featureless plane. This is the very logic of capitalism this book aims to investigate. Marx himself paid more attention to the socioeconomic character of space than we think. For example, in the Grundrisse, the well-known phrase, the annihilation of space by time, appears 3 times, and in relation to it, a long discourse was added on the mysterious character of roads, R-O-A-D-S, roads. The theory of the surplus value points out that the nature of the two-sided character of material space, which will be mentioned later in this book, chapter 1, is a metaphor for explaining goods. Space appears in Marx's Capital in the description of transportation expenses and distribution periods in Volume 2, as well as the treatment of location in the ground rent theory in Volume 3. Of course, these discussions in Marx's own literature are not intended to build a spatial theory of the political economy itself, but form parts of the explanation and critique of the capitalist mode of production, such as the period of circulation of capital and the economic basis of the existence of the class of landowners. Therefore, not sufficient to just cut and paste such phrases and to claim it as a Marxist theory of space. The task of building a spatial theory of political economy is thus still left to scholars of subsequent generations. Now, developments among past critical geographers. This theoretical endeavor has been carried out mostly by critical geographers in North America and other English-speaking countries for half a century. There's also an agenda for Japanese critical geographers up until 1972, Mizuoka et al. 2005, which will be discussed in more detail in the afterword of this book. By the 1970s, Marxist geographers in North America had become more concerned with theoretical extensions of Marxist social science, particularly with respect to space, than with other applications of existing Marxist categories to empirical field research, which characterized Marxist geography before then. According to Richard Peet, 1977, this is a second, more innovative cycle of North American Marxist geography, marked by creative additions to Marxist theory. As stated above, space was also a major research concern of Lefebvre. In the first cycle, Marxist geographers had simply applied their existing theory and concepts to empirical research findings to describe problems. Even if this was based on the theory of Marxist social science to some extent, primitive generic propositions had directly been applied to cities or regions. In terms of the theoretical research of social science, nothing was added to the theoretical understanding. No new theoretical categories have been created to explain the spatial processes and structures of society. Various phenomena related to these general propositions had been treated as mere expressions of these general and primitive propositions. George Hegel wrote, "Beginning cannot be made with anything concrete. If impatience with the consideration of the abstract beginning should provoke anyone to say that the beginning should be made not with the beginning, but straight away with the subject matter itself, well then, this subject matter is nothing else but the said empty beginning. For what this subject matter is, that will be explicated only in the development of the science and cannot be presupposed by it as known beforehand." For the impatient first cycle geographers who claim themselves to be somewhat critical, the path at the introductory level can be negotiated well enough. However, when the path of research passes beyond the inflection point into the terrain of innovative theorization, the trail suddenly becomes rugged and unbeaten. Here, the concepts of existing Marxist social science function merely as a generic footholds with which the intellectual enthusiasm to break through drives critical researchers not content with the established ideas of social science to proceed. If the rugged path of research started at the very beginning of learning, people would have been more prepared at the outset. Researchers who want to develop Elaborate quantum theory, for example, cannot use empirical and journalistic statements to condemn the current situation. In this context, the contributions of North American critical geographers were remarkable in the transcendence from the first and second cycles. The real contribution of Marxist geography in North America and of Lefebvre in France is that it succeeded in making this breakthrough, passing through this inflection point and elevating these empirical phenomena of geography into the real categories of Marxist social science. Marxist geography thereby became a real part and parcel of the whole body of Marxism. Their efforts were essentially centered, of course, around the concept of space. Now, the structure of this book attempts to explain the present, at least in 2004 too, the present socio-spatial phenomena as a rich whole in theory, not as mere chaotic representation. This process will bring fresh and open life to Marxist social science. In this sense, this book is an addition to prior innovative theoretical endeavors in its attempt to revive Marxism. As Lefebvre pointed out, quote, each of the concepts of Marxism may be taken up once more and carried to a higher level without any significant moment of the theory as in a whole being lost, close quote. Now, to meet this task, the book builds a sequential set of dialectics. Chapter 1 identifies two logical moments that should be incorporated in the theoretical body of Marxism in analyzing the Marxist theory of space. The first logical moment is ascent, A-S-C-E-N-T, ascent. Based on Marx's argument in the Grundrisse, the ascent shows the way to position space within the entire logical unfolding of Marxist economics. The second logical moment is subsumption. So, first logical moment is ascent. Second logical moment is subsumption, originating in the quote, result of the immediate process of production by Marx. Subsumption is the Marxist concept of incorporating something external to the theoretical body into Marxism. Marxism as a social science is a social science based on the principle of materialism. Therefore, Chapter 2 presents the material base of the theory, the nature of space in material or pristine form or physical space, free from any human actions in it. Pristine space has the dual and contradictory attributes of absolute and relative. This chapter discusses generally how pristine space is subsumed into society. Chapter 3 deals with the dialectics on pristine absolute space and its subsumption into society. The homogeneous and all-embracing nature of pristine absolute space has the social implication of liberty, equality, and fraternity. It even has homogenizing physical power. Absolute space works negatively and can therefore be detrimental to society based on separation and discrimination. State or economic power that is not amenable to this property of absolute space attempts to negate it by bounding the expanse of space with a produced space, that is, by imposing boundaries. Fragmentation and differentiation of spaces thus ensue. Chapter 4 deals with the parallel dialectics of the subsumption of relative space. Pristine relative space has dividing and individualizing properties, which imply discrimination and segregation in society. The divided space functions in contradiction to the integration of society. Relative space has thus to be annihilated. Relative space has thus to be annihilated through agglomeration, as well as through the construction of a network of the means of transportation and communication. However, the network becomes more sparse and uneven as the means of transportation travel at higher speeds or a vehicle for transportation has a larger capacity. The chapter deals with this paradox of spatial integration. From the processes of the subsuming space, the logical scene by now turns to the absolute and relative attributes of pristine space, altogether with the elements of produced space that come out of the processes of subsumption. That is, bounding, agglomeration, and spatial integration. Bounding, agglomeration, and spatial integration. They are combined together to form relational space. The fundamental dialectical dichotomy of the relational space is contiguity and separation. The dominant societal and economic system strives to place the entire system of relational space under its domination and control. Chapter 5 explains the socio-spatial process of this dialectical relation of relational space that leads to the production of a spatial configuration of society overall, which is the subsumption of the subsumption of relational space. The configuration of relational space is subsumed into society through two processes: vertically as territorial integration, homologous to Walter Christoller's central place theory, and horizontally as land use coordination. It's a logic similar to that of Johann Heinrich von Thunen. So you can see already the classical elements of geography are there. The configuration of relational space is etched onto the land surface and the human mind. The former is, of course, the built environment, the physical materialization of space. The huge cost of producing the built environment induces the state power into the production process. It thus becomes social relations made tangible and visible. As the built environment is a part of the material space, it can change its shape only when certain economic conditions are met. The built environment, therefore, forms a fetter for society in its development and functions to curb the movement of the oppressed to achieve their own autonomy and freedom. Chapter 6 deals with these points in drawing upon the arguments of David Harvey and Japanese Marxist economists. Indeed. Chapter 7 deals with the native as well as contrived bond of space and body in terms of the, quote, autogenous, autogenous, autogenous bond of space and body. The configuration of relative space is integrated with the human body in various ways, autogenously through the quotidian contact of the human mind with space. However, it is bound to be alienated by the space and capitalist powers. These powers manipulate and destroy the bond such that it will support their domination and control, then displace the land into contrived ones. Chapter 8 turns back to the capitalist space, yet this time in its dynamism. The capitalist spatial configuration is always subject to the crisis-prone business cycle. This chapter analyzes the cycle in close relation to space. Ultimately, the repeated cycles culminate in a tendential fall in the rate of profit, which triggers global capitalism to mobilize countervailing forces to overcome the profit squeeze. This leads to a new capitalist regime of neoliberalism and the production of a global configuration of economic space, most notably the new international division of labor. The subsumption of space by the state and capitalist power that this book discusses is never complete. The space that remains unsubsumed can be deployed by the oppressed people, serving as an important strategic element of class, ethnic, and other social struggles of the people against the state and capitalist power. Chapter 9 presents various spatial strategies for these struggles in referencing the logics and concepts that this book has developed in the preceding chapters. As a case study, this chapter presents the struggle against human rights infringement committed by the Child Guidance Center in Japan, in which I have taken part for several years. The sum of the arguments of this book will confirm the statement that social relations and struggles against them, which are concrete abstractions, have no real existence save in and through space. Their underpinning is spatial, exposing their spatial underpinnings of power relations and the struggles contesting them is the ultimate task of this book. It's interesting that the introduction comes prior to a description of the contents, but here they are. And we looked at all of those. We're going to look at all of those discussions relative to chapter 1. Note that in chapter 2, this notion of a pristine space is developed. Number 3, absolute space and boundary porosity, a variety of things. Relative space is chapter 4. The real subsumption of space by eliminating space itself, agglomeration. Number 5 is on relational space, multiple layers of space superimposed upon each other, etc., with, of course, the first form of territorial integration and the second form of land use coordination. And then, of course, number 6, the built environment, subsumption of the built environment in capitalism, and the relocation of the elements of the built environment in the market economy. Number 7 is the autogenous bond of space and body. Spatial configuration and lived space carved into the body, the manipulation and alienation of the autogenous bond by state and economic powers, and the manipulation of cognitive space by state and economic power. And you can see where that overlaps with what we were just looking at in terms of cognitive capitalism. 8 is on business cycles, falling rates of profit, dynamism of capitalist space, stagnation and recovery, the amassing of contradictions during the modern period, and then stuff as a 4-stage description of this whole business of prices, etc., including, of course, neoliberalism. Spatial struggles for emancipation, spatial praxis, and then struggles around absolute space, struggles around relative space. To accompany agglomeration, you can have counter agglomeration and stray spaces, counter networks. And then there are struggles around relational space, that is poor people's optimum and Christoller's central place system. And then struggles around scale, spatial scale, porosity, and scale jumping. And then the emancipation from authoritative space. So personal stuff is begins to be engaged. Anyway, so let us see where we are at the present moment. Chapter 1, the fundamental moments in formulating Martian, Marxian spatial theory. So ascent, descent, etc. Ascent and descent, the method of political economy. In the relation between abstraction and reality, there are, on the one hand, abstract categories, and on the other, empirical and concrete facts. The task here is to discover the dialectics between them. Without it, the claim for dialectics remains a mere melange of words with little theoretical content. Both reductionism, where every aspect of reality is associated with simplistic theoretical elements, and empirical eclecticism, where the structure of society is considered to be an eclectic graphing of various two logical moments to be incorporated into the theoretical body of Marxism in analyzing space are identified. That is ascent, A-S-C-E-N-T, ascent, and subsumption. Based on Marx's argument and Grundrisse, the ascent is demonstrated in section 3 in introducing money into capital. Space is positioned in the same dialectical way in the entire logical unfolding of Marxist economics. Subsumption originates in the results of the immediate process of production by Marx. This book expands the application of this concept more generally to incorporate anything external dialectically into the theoretical body of Marxism, from Marx's application only to the labor process. Section 5 testifies to the position of Marxist geography within Marxism, drawing upon Engels' classification of the sciences. Introduction. Our first theoretical task lies in identifying in the logics of Marxian social science the fundamental moments upon which the critical theory of space unfolds. Two fundamental moments for this task are identified: ascent and subsumption. 1.2, ascent and descent. A, the method of political economy. In the relation between abstraction and reality, there are, on the one hand, abstract categories, and on the other, empirical and concrete facts. The task here is to discover the dialectics between them. Without it, the claim for dialectics remains a mere melange of words with little theoretical content. Both reductionism, where every aspect of reality is associated with simplistic theoretical elements, and empirical eclecticism, where the structure of society is considered to be an eclectic grafting of various fragmented empirical facts, are inevitable. An eclectic grafting of are inevitable with a proper understanding of the methodology of abstraction. Quote, seems to be correct to begin with the real and the concrete, with the real precondition, thus to begin in economics with, for example, the population, which is the foundation and the subject of the entire social set of production, social act of production. However, on closer examination, this proves false. The population is an abstraction if I leave out, for example, the classes of which it is composed. These classes, in turn, are an empty phrase if I am not familiar with the elements on which they rest, that is, wage labor, capital, etc. These latter, in turn, presuppose exchange. Division of labor, prices, etc. For example, capital is nothing without wage labor, without value, money, prices, etc. I think we'll proceed a little bit further and then close on this diagram here, I think it's important to consider what he means by all this jazz here and its integration with a dialectical method or methodology. And fortunately goes through a fairly decent description of the difference between formal and real subsumption, and then other elements, as it were, that relate as well. So that's kind of where we're going to head, and we'll probably finish this up tomorrow, and then move on to the next thing, either chapter 2 in the text or something else. So let me return to the meeting.